At 6:30 in the morning on June 6, 1944, the sky above the English Channel was gray and heavy with clouds. The sea churned beneath thousands of vessels stretching from horizon to horizon, the largest invasion fleet ever assembled in human history. Packed inside small wooden boats, young American soldiers gripped their rifles with white knuckles, their faces pale from seasickness and terror. The boats rose and fell with the swells, spray soaking the men as they approached the coastline of France. These were Higgins boats, flat-bottomed, wooden-sided, barely 36 feet long. They looked almost primitive compared to the massive battleships and destroyers escorting them. The German defenders on the cliffs above could not have known that these humble vessels, dismissed for years as useless by the very navy that now depended on them, would prove to be among the most important weapons of the entire war. When the steel ramps dropped that morning, men charged forward into a wall of machine gun fire. Some boats landed in the wrong places. Some were hit by artillery before they reached the sand. Others struck underwater obstacles that tore open their hulls. But they kept coming. Wave after wave, hour after hour. More than 1,500 Higgins-designed landing craft ferried more than 150,000 Allied soldiers onto the beaches of Normandy in the first 24 hours alone. By nightfall, the liberation of Europe had begun. 20 years after the war ended, former President Dwight Eisenhower sat in his office in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. He was meeting with a young historian named Stephen Ambrose, discussing his experiences as Supreme Allied Commander. The two men talked for an entire afternoon about what access Ambrose would have to Eisenhower's papers and what would be involved in writing the general's biography. Near the end of their conversation, Eisenhower noticed that Ambrose was teaching at a university in New Orleans. He asked the young historian if he had ever known a man named Andrew Higgins. Ambrose said he had not. Higgins had died in 1952 before Ambrose moved to New Orleans. Eisenhower looked at the young historian and said words that would reshape how history remembered the war. He said that Andrew Higgins was the man who won the war for us. Ambrose's jaw dropped at a statement like that from a source like that. Eisenhower continued. He explained that if Higgins had not designed and built those landing craft, the Allies could never have landed over an open beach. He did not know how they ever would have gotten back into Europe. The whole strategy of the war would have been different. Coming from the man who had planned and commanded the invasion of Europe, this was an astonishing claim. How could a small wooden boat designed by a Nebraskan boat builder from the swamps of Louisiana have changed the course of the greatest conflict in human history? The answer lies in one of the most remarkable untold stories of World War II, a story of genius, stubbornness, bureaucratic warfare, and a single dramatic showdown that proved the experts wrong. The Higgins boat, officially designated the landing craft vehicle personnel, was a deceptively simple vessel. It measured just over 36 feet in length and nearly 11 feet in width. Its hull was constructed primarily of plywood, keeping the weight down and the cost low while conserving precious steel for other war production. The sides offered some protection from small arms fire but were never intended to withstand direct hits from artillery or heavy weapons. The boat was powered by a 225 horsepower gray marine diesel engine that could push it through the water at 12 knots, roughly 14 miles per hour. This was not particularly fast by naval standards, but speed was never the primary requirement. What mattered was reliability, shallow draft, and the ability to operate in conditions that would ground or swamp conventional vessels. What made the Higgins boat revolutionary was not its speed or its armament, which consisted of just 2.30 caliber machine guns mounted for the crew's self-defense. What made it revolutionary was its ability to do things no other landing craft could do. Its flat bottom and shallow draft allowed it to operate in as little as 3 feet of water at the stern and just over 2 feet at the bow. This meant it could run directly onto a beach, something conventional boats with their V-shaped hulls could never accomplish without becoming hopelessly stuck. The protected propeller, housed in a tunnel stern that Higgins had originally designed for navigating debris-choked Louisiana bayous, kept the mechanism safe from sand and debris when the boat grounded itself on shore. Conventional propellers would be destroyed within minutes of operating in such conditions. The tunnel design meant the Higgins boat could run onto a beach, sit on the sand while troops disembarked, and then back off into deep water without any damage to its propulsion system. And most importantly, The steel ramp at the bow could drop in seconds, allowing 36 fully equipped combat soldiers to charge straight forward onto the beach. This was a radical departure from all previous landing craft designs, which required troops to climb over the sides and drop into the water while exposed to enemy fire from every direction. The bow ramp concentrated the disembarkation into a single protected channel, allowing men to reach the beach faster with less exposure. Within 3 to 4 minutes, the boat could disembark its troops, raise its ramp, reverse itself off the sand, and return to its mother ship for another load. This rapid turnaround capability meant that a relatively small number of boats could deliver enormous numbers of troops in a short time. It transformed amphibious operations from slow, grinding affairs into rapid assaults that could overwhelm defenders before they could react. Alternatively, the Higgins boat could carry a jeep and 12 soldiers or up to 8,100 pounds of cargo. This flexibility made it invaluable for the complex logistics of amphibious warfare, where the ability to land men, vehicles, and supplies quickly could mean the difference between victory and catastrophe. The same boat that delivered infantry in the first wave could return with ammunition, medical supplies, or light vehicles as the beachhead expanded. To understand how this boat came to exist, one must first understand the man who created it. Andrew Jackson Higgins was born on August 28, 1886, in Columbus, Nebraska, far from any ocean. He was the youngest of 7 children of Irish-American parents, and from his earliest years, he showed a stubborn independence that would define his entire life. He was expelled from school for fighting, a pattern that would repeat throughout his life. He started a grass-cutting business at age 9 and rapidly expanded it until he was employing other boys to cut grass throughout the neighborhood. At 12 years old, he built his first boat in the family basement. It was an ice boat, and when completed, he realized it was far too large to fit through the basement doors or windows. While his mother was away shopping, young Higgins borrowed jacks from a nearby construction site and removed a section of the basement wall between 2 windows. He and a friend extracted the boat, then rebuilt the wall section before his mother returned. This story captured everything about the man he would become: bold, resourceful, willing to bend rules when necessary, and absolutely determined to accomplish what he set out to do, regardless of what obstacles stood in his way. As a young man, Higgins moved south to Louisiana and entered the lumber business. The swamps and bayous of the Mississippi Delta presented a unique challenge for anyone trying to extract timber. The waterways were shallow, rarely more than a few feet deep and often much less. They were choked with vegetation, submerged logs, and constantly shifting sediment. Conventional boats could not navigate these treacherous conditions. Their hulls would run aground, their propellers would foul on debris, and their deep drafts would leave them stuck in the mud. So Higgins designed his own boats. He took a correspondence course in naval architecture, studying engineering principles through mail-order lessons while working full-time in the lumber trade. By 1926, he had created what he called the Eureka boat. It was a flat-bottomed, shallow-draft craft with a revolutionary protected propeller housed in a tunnel stern. It could operate in as little as 18 in of water, navigate the twisting bayou channels at high speed, and run directly onto muddy banks before backing itself off with ease. His customers were trappers who needed to access remote areas of the swamps. They were oil drillers whose exploration teams required transportation through roadless wetlands. And according to persistent rumors that Higgins never entirely denied, they included Prohibition-era bootleggers looking for fast boats to outrun the Coast Guard on dark Louisiana nights. Some accounts suggest that Higgins sold fast boats to the Coast Guard for chasing rum runners, then turned around and sold even faster boats to the rum runners themselves. Whether or not these stories are entirely true, they captured the essence of Andrew Higgins. He was a businessman first, and he would sell to anyone who was buying. He had no particular loyalty to either side of the law. He had loyalty only to his boats and to his conviction that he built the best shallow water vessels in the world. Life magazine profiled him in August 1943 and described his personality in vivid terms. His profanity, the magazine noted, when called into play, flowed as naturally as water from a spring and was famous for its opulence and volume. He drank Old Taylor bourbon prodigiously, though he claimed he only drank while he was working, which was essentially all the time. He fought at the drop of a hat and had been known to throw punches at business rivals and Navy officers alike. He was, in short, the kind of man that bureaucrats instinctively distrusted and military brass could not control. He had no respect for rank, no patience for procedures, and no interest in diplomatic niceties. When he believed he was right, which was most of the time, he said so in terms that left no room for misunderstanding. By the early 1930s, the United States military was beginning to grapple with a problem that had haunted commanders for centuries. How do you land an army on a hostile shore? The question was not merely academic. Military planners understood that any future war with Japan would require extensive operations across the Pacific, island-hopping campaigns that would demand amphibious assaults against defended beaches. Any effort to liberate a German-occupied Europe would require crossing the English Channel and landing on the heavily fortified coast of France. Traditional naval strategy required capturing enemy ports, which were invariably the most heavily defended points on any coastline. Ports had docks and cranes and all the facilities needed to unload large transports, but they also had coastal batteries, anti-ship mines, and concentrated garrison forces. The bloody disaster at Gallipoli in 1915 demonstrated how catastrophic amphibious operations could become without proper equipment and doctrine. Allied forces suffered over 200,000 casualties trying to establish a beachhead on the Turkish coast. Men were slaughtered by the thousands while trying to climb from small boats onto defended beaches. The United States Marine Corps had been developing amphibious warfare concepts throughout the 1920s and 30s, but they lacked one essential element. They had no landing craft capable of reliably delivering men and equipment from ship to shore across open beaches. The boats available to them were either too fragile, too slow, or unable to operate in shallow water. Men had to leap over the sides into neck-deep surf, becoming easy targets for enemy fire while struggling with their heavy equipment and fighting against the currents. In 1934, Andrew Higgins visited the Marine Corps base at Quantico, Virginia, hoping to interest them in his Eureka boat. The Marines recognized the potential immediately. Here was a boat that could run onto a beach and back off again, operate in shallow water where other vessels would ground themselves, and carry substantial loads at reasonable speed. The officers who tested the Eureka were enthusiastic. They reported that it outperformed everything else they had tried, but the Marines did not make procurement decisions. That authority belonged to the Navy, and the Navy had no interest in what some civilian boat builder from the Louisiana swamps was peddling. The Bureau of Ships, as the Navy's design and construction authority was known, preferred to develop its own landing craft internally. Bureau officials saw no reason to listen to what one historian later described as some parvenu hick from the swamps of Louisiana, far from the traditional shipyards in the East. They had their own designs, their own engineers, and their own ideas about what the Navy needed. The notion that a self-taught boat builder with no formal naval architecture credentials could improve upon their work struck them as absurd. When Higgins visited the Bureau in Washington and saw their competing boat blueprints, he was appalled by what he considered fundamental design flaws. He scrawled across the drawings a message that read, "This boat stinks," and signed his initials. This did not endear him to the naval establishment. Bureau officials were not accustomed to being told their work was inadequate by civilians with mud on their boots and bourbon on their breath. What followed was one of the most frustrating bureaucratic battles in American military history. For 5 years from 1937 through 1942, the Bureau of Ships actively blocked Higgins from supplying landing craft to the military. When Higgins' boats consistently outperformed the Bureau's own designs in competitive trials, the Bureau simply ignored the results. Test after test showed the Eureka running circles around Navy designs, handling rough water more capably, landing troops faster, and operating in shallower conditions. The Bureau dismissed the evidence. When forced to acknowledge the Higgins boat's superiority in certain tests, Bureau officials scrapped their failed designs, copied elements from the Eureka, and began building their own version, essentially plagiarizing the man they refused to do business with. They took his tunnel stern design, his flat bottom configuration, and his shallow draft principles, then produced inferior copies while continuing to reject his contracts. The Bureau insisted that all landing craft must be 30 feet long to fit the existing davits on Navy ships. These davits were the mechanical arms used to lower small boats from the decks of larger vessels. Higgins argued that a 36-foot boat would perform far better, carrying more men with better seakeeping characteristics. The Bureau refused to consider modifying the davits. Higgins shot back that they should design davits to fit a proper-sized boat, not handicap the boat to fit inadequate davits. He told a room full of Navy officials that there were no officers, whether present in the room or anywhere else in the Navy, who knew anything about small boat design, construction, or operation. But he did. He had built small boats for decades while they had been pushing papers in Washington. This confrontational attitude did not help his cause, but Higgins was convinced that American lives were at stake, and he refused to back down. The Bureau's own landing craft malfunctioned repeatedly in tests. Reports from fleet exercises documented boats that took on water, boats that could not back off beaches, boats that capsized in moderate seas. Yet the Bureau persisted in blocking Higgins' contracts. Meanwhile, a young Marine lieutenant was gathering intelligence that would prove crucial to the Higgins boat's development. In 1937, First Lieutenant Victor Krulak was serving as a military observer in Shanghai during the Japanese invasion of China. The Second Sino-Japanese War had erupted that summer, and American officers were studying Japanese military techniques with considerable interest. Krulak did more than simply observe from a safe distance. At dawn one morning in late August, he sailed a Navy tugboat directly into the midst of a Japanese landing operation at the mouth of the Yangtze River, flying the American flag to signify neutrality. Accompanied by a Navy photographer and an aide to Admiral Harry Yarnell, he photographed and sketched the Japanese landing craft in action. He noticed something remarkable about their design. The Japanese Daihatsu-class boats featured an innovation no American vessel possessed: a retractable ramp at the bow that allowed troops to disembark straight forward rather than climbing over the sides. This meant Japanese soldiers could hit the beach running while American troops were still struggling to haul themselves over gunwales and drop into the surf. Krulak recognized immediately that this design could transform amphibious warfare. He produced a 13-page report with photographs, drawings, and technical specifications. Instead of men presenting themselves as individual targets while climbing out of boats, they could charge forward together in a concentrated rush. The psychological and tactical advantages were obvious. He sent his detailed reports and photographs back to Washington, expecting his intelligence to receive immediate attention. The Navy's response was to file his reports away with a dismissive notation indicating the material came from some nut out in China. The photographs were buried in bureaucratic archives. The analysis was ignored. That nut would eventually become a 3-star general, and his photographs would provide the final piece of the puzzle that made the Higgins boat truly revolutionary. By 1941, war was clearly approaching, and the Marines were desperate. They had seen the Higgins boat perform brilliantly in fleet exercises year after year. In 1939, the commanding officer of the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, filed a report after extensive testing. He stated that the Higgins boat gave the best performance under all conditions. It had more speed, more maneuverability, handled easier, and landed troops higher on the beach than any competing design. It also had greater power in backing off the beach. Not once was the boat observed having difficulty in retracting. General Holland Smith, nicknamed Howling Mad for his explosive temper and aggressive advocacy for Marine interests, became one of the strongest champions of the Higgins boat. He later wrote that to get the boat the Marines needed, they went straight to the builder, Andrew Higgins, discussed plans with him, and he built the ramp boat. While the Bureau of Ships was still dazed by the temerity of their suggestion, Smith believed the Higgins boat contributed more to their common victory than any other piece of equipment. But the Marines could not override the Bureau of Ships. The Bureau controlled procurement, and the Bureau wanted nothing to do with Andrew Higgins. The Marines could advocate. They could protest. They could send report after report documenting the superiority of Higgins' designs. None of it mattered. The Bureau had decided that it would develop its own landing craft, and no amount of evidence would change that decision. In March 1941, General Holland Smith sent Captain Krulak to New Orleans to meet Andrew Higgins directly. Krulak brought his photographs and sketches of the Japanese ramp-bowed landing craft that Washington had dismissed. Years had passed since he first submitted his intelligence reports, and nothing had been done with the information. Now he hoped that perhaps a civilian contractor might be more receptive. Higgins immediately grasped the concept's potential. Unlike the Navy bureaucrats, he recognized a good idea when he saw one, regardless of where it came from. The Japanese had solved the disembarkation problem with elegant simplicity. A ramp instead of a ladder, forward motion instead of awkward climbing. Higgins saw at once how this could be adapted to his existing designs. Working at his own expense without any Navy contract or guarantee of reimbursement, Higgins began building prototypes of a ramped version of his Eureka boat. By late May 1941, he had 3 completed and ready for testing. The Navy had said it could not be done in such a short time. Higgins replied with a phrase that would become characteristic of his entire career. He shouted back at them that they should just be there in 3 days and he would have working boats to show them. On May 26, 1941, Commander Ross Daggett from the Navy Bureau of Ships and Major Ernest Linnert, Secretary of the Marine Corps Equipment Board, witnessed demonstrations on Lake Pontchartrain near New Orleans. The tests involved offloading a truck and embarking and disembarking 36 Higgins employees who simulated combat troops. The results were everything Higgins had promised. The ramp transformed an already excellent design into something revolutionary. Instead of troops climbing over the sides and presenting themselves as easy targets, they could now charge straight forward the instant the ramp dropped. The entire disembarkation could be completed in seconds rather than minutes. Men could hit the beach with their weapons ready and their formations intact. On December 8, 1941, the day after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Andrew Higgins filed his patent for the retractable steel bow ramp. The timing was not coincidental. Higgins knew that war had come, and he wanted his design protected before the inevitable flood of military orders began. United States Patent Number 2,341,866 would be issued on February 15, 1944, just months before D-Day. It would eventually be recognized as one of the most important military innovations of the 20th century. But the Bureau of Ships still would not relent. Even as America mobilized for global war, Bureau officials continued blocking Higgins' contracts and pushing their own inferior designs. It was a remarkable display of bureaucratic stubbornness in the face of national emergency. Men were dying. Time was critical. And still the Bureau refused to acknowledge that an outsider had built something better than anything they could produce. It took intervention from the highest levels of government to finally break the deadlock. Senator Harry S. Truman of Missouri had established the Senate Special Committee to investigate the National Defense Program in March 1941, several months before Pearl Harbor. This body was tasked with rooting out waste, fraud, and inefficiency in America's war production. As the war effort expanded, the Truman Committee became one of the most powerful oversight bodies in Washington. Andrew Higgins traveled to Washington and made his case directly to Senator Truman. He brought documentation of the Navy's obstruction. He brought test results showing his boats outperforming Bureau designs. He brought evidence that the Bureau had copied his innovations while refusing to buy his products. And he brought his characteristic bluntness about what all of this meant for American fighting men. Truman was won over. He had seen enough evidence that the Bureau of Ships was sabotaging the war effort to protect its bureaucratic turf. The senator demanded a definitive head-to-head test that would settle the matter once and for all. No more excuses. No more bureaucratic maneuvering. One test conducted under controlled conditions with observers from multiple agencies present to document the results. On May 25, 1942, both boats were brought to Norfolk, Virginia, for the contest that would determine the future of American amphibious warfare. The test was simple but demanding. Both vessels had to carry a 30-ton tank through choppy seas and land on a beach. The conditions were deliberately challenging, designed to simulate actual combat situations where landing craft would have to operate in heavy weather. What happened next became legendary. The Bureau of Ships craft struggled from the start. In the rough water, it began taking on dangerous amounts of spray. The boat pitched and rolled alarmingly. The design that had looked acceptable in calm water tests showed its fundamental flaws when the waves started building. At one point, sailors on board were observed sitting on the railings, preparing to jump overboard if the vessel capsized. The Bureau boat nearly sank before it could even reach the beach. It wallowed helplessly in the swells, unable to maintain course or speed. Meanwhile, the Higgins boat handled perfectly. It cut through the waves with minimal difficulty, its flat bottom skimming over the swells while its tunnel stern kept the propeller protected from debris in the churning water. The boat reached the shore, deployed its tank without incident, and then turned around to rescue the floundering Navy vessel. The Higgins boat had to tow its competitor back to port. The demonstration could not have been more conclusive. Observers from the Army, the Marines, and the Navy all witnessed the same thing. The Bureau's design had failed catastrophically. The Higgins design had succeeded flawlessly. There was no technical ambiguity to argue about, no room for interpretation, no bureaucratic escape route. An Army officer present at the Norfolk test wrote in his official assessment that as far as comparison of characteristics was concerned, there was simply no comparison. It was clearly demonstrated even to enlisted men accompanying the tests that the Higgins lighter could get them there in a choppy sea, and the other lighter just could not make the trip. The Truman Committee's formal report was devastating. It concluded that the Bureau of Ships had stubbornly persisted for over 5 years in clinging to an unseaworthy tank lighter design of its own. The report accused the Bureau of disregard for the facts, if not the safety and success of American troops. The language was as harsh as any official government document of the era. Careers were destroyed. Leadership was replaced. In October 1942, new leadership was installed at the Bureau of Ships. Andrew Higgins finally received his contracts. The vindication was complete, but 5 years had been lost. 5 years during which American forces had gone to war without adequate landing craft. 5 years during which better-equipped enemies had seized the initiative across the Pacific and prepared their defenses in Europe. The cost of bureaucratic obstruction would never be fully calculated. Now Higgins had to make up for lost time. His small New Orleans boatyard, which had employed about 75 workers before the war, began an expansion that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Higgins Industries eventually operated 7 major plants throughout the New Orleans area, employing more than 20,000 workers at peak production. The factory floors became temples of American industrial might. Huge banners hung in the rafters with slogans like, "The guy who relaxes is helping the Axis." Workers labored around the clock in 3 shifts, 7 days a week. At peak production, Higgins Industries was turning out more than 700 boats per month. When factory space ran short, the city of New Orleans closed streets around the Higgins plants so workers could build boats outdoors in the thoroughfares. By September 1943, the statistics were staggering. Of the more than 14,000 vessels in the United States Navy's combat motorboat fleet, more than 90% had been designed by Higgins Industries. This figure reflected the enormous numbers of small craft required for amphibious operations, a remarkable testament to one man's vision and one company's productive capacity. One detail of Higgins Industries deserves special mention. Despite operating in the segregated Deep South of the 1940s, Andrew Higgins employed the first fully integrated workforce in New Orleans. Black and white workers labored side by side on the assembly lines. Men and women earned equal pay for equal work. Minorities were promoted to supervisory positions based on their abilities rather than their race. This was extraordinary for Louisiana in that era and made Higgins powerful enemies among local white elites who viewed his practices as a threat to the established social order. But Higgins did not care about local customs or social conventions. He needed the best workers he could find, and he was not going to let racism interfere with winning the war. His employees were building boats that would carry American soldiers to battle. Nothing else mattered. The Higgins boat made its combat debut at Guadalcanal in August 1942, the first major American ground offensive of the Pacific War. Marines hitting the beaches that day rode in on boats that had been considered useless by the Navy establishment just months earlier. The landing succeeded. The boats performed exactly as Higgins had promised. In November 1942, Operation Torch brought American forces to North Africa. Higgins boats landed troops on beaches across Morocco and Algeria, demonstrating their versatility in the diverse conditions of the Mediterranean theater. Sicily fell in July 1943. Salerno came in September. Each landing relied on the little wooden boats that Andrew Higgins had fought so hard to build. But the supreme test was yet to come. Operation Overlord, the long-awaited invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, would require amphibious operations on a scale never before attempted in human history. Everything depended on getting enough men and equipment across the beaches of Normandy fast enough to establish a defensible beachhead before German reinforcements could counterattack. General Dwight D. Eisenhower understood this better than anyone. In March 1943, he confided that when he died, his coffin should be in the shape of a landing craft because they were practically killing him with worry. The availability of landing craft determined when the invasion could be launched and how many troops could be committed to the initial assault. Without sufficient boats, the entire operation was impossible. On June 6, 1944, the wait finally ended. More than 6,000 ships and landing craft crossed the English Channel in the darkness before dawn. The target was an 80-kilometer stretch of the Normandy coast, divided into 5 sectors with code names that would become immortal: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. More than 1,500 Higgins-designed landing craft participated in the initial assault. The conditions that morning were far from ideal. Strong winds had delayed the invasion by 24 hours and still churned the channel into a gray mass of whitecaps and swells. The small landing craft, with their flat bottoms and shallow drafts, pitched and rolled violently. Seasickness was almost universal among the troops packed shoulder to shoulder in the cramped vessels. The run to the beach typically took about an hour from the transport ships. The men had nothing to do but wait, soaked by spray, surrounded by the sounds of naval bombardment, watching the coastline grow slowly larger through the gray morning light. Some prayed, some sat in stunned silence, contemplating what awaited them on the sand. The oldest among them were in their 30s. Many were teenagers. All of them knew that some of the men standing beside them would not survive the next hour. Frank DeVita was a Coast Guard gunner's mate 3rd class serving aboard the transport ship Samuel Chase. Originally assigned to operate the ship's guns, he had been reassigned just before D-Day to work as a bowman on the Higgins boats, responsible for lowering and raising the steel ramp that would release soldiers onto the beach. He later recalled his first run toward Omaha Beach that morning. He said he did not want to drop the ramp. He knew that once he dropped the ramp, the machine gun bullets that were hitting it would come into his boat. The German defenses on Omaha were the strongest of any beach, and the defenders had a clear field of fire down onto the landing craft. The ramp fell. Only a handful of soldiers made it off before the withering fire cut them down. The ramp would not close because dead soldiers' bodies had fallen against it, pinning it in place. DeVita had to crawl over the dead men to free the mechanism and close the ramp. He returned to the Samuel Chase with his boat damaged and his nerves shattered. Then he faced a decision that would define the rest of his life. He could stay aboard the ship, safe from the machine guns waiting on the beach, or he could go back into the belly of the beast and face the guns again. He made his choice. He said this was what he had been trained to do. He went back. 15 times over the next 18 hours, he made the run to Omaha Beach. 15 times he dropped his ramp into the murderous fire and prayed that his passengers would survive long enough to reach cover. Decades later, in June 2014, the French government awarded DeVita the Legion of Honor for his service on D-Day, recognizing the extraordinary courage of a young man from Brooklyn who chose to face death again and again rather than abandon his duty. DeVita was not unique. Thousands of young Americans piloted Higgins boats into the teeth of German defenses that day. Many were Navy and Coast Guard sailors who had received their training at courses Andrew Higgins ran at his own expense. He had personally overseen the instruction of more than 30,000 soldiers and sailors in the proper operation of his boats, determined that the men who used his designs would know how to handle them in combat. The most iconic photograph of World War II captures this moment, titled Into the Jaws of Death. It was shot by Coast Guard chief photographer's mate Robert F. Sargent from the back of a Higgins boat at approximately 7:40 in the morning on June 6. It shows soldiers of Company E, 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, wading toward the easy red sector of Omaha Beach, their rifles held above the churning surf, the ramp of the landing craft framing the shot like a doorway into hell. Sargent was serving aboard the same ship as Frank DeVita, the Samuel Chase. That single image, reproduced millions of times in books and newspapers and eventually inspiring the opening sequence of the film Saving Private Ryan, gave the Higgins boat a place in collective memory that its humble appearance would never have suggested. When people today think of D-Day, they think of that photograph. They think of the steel ramp and the wooden sides and the men who charged forward into history. By the end of June 6th, more than 150,000 Allied troops had landed on the beaches of Normandy. Within days, that number had grown to more than 300,000. Within a month, more than 800,000 men, 150,000 vehicles, and 570,000 tons of supplies had crossed those beaches. The beachhead had expanded into a full-scale invasion. None of it would have been possible without the Higgins boat. The Germans had built their Atlantic wall defenses around the assumption that the Allies would have to capture fortified ports to land their armies in significant numbers. They had concentrated their strongest forces around Cherbourg, Le Havre, Calais, and other major harbor cities. The ability of Higgins boats to land across open beaches meant that Allied commanders could choose where to invade rather than being forced to attack the most heavily defended positions. This single capability transformed the strategic equation of the entire war. It allowed the Allies to strike where the enemy was weakest rather than where he was strongest. It made the liberation of Europe possible. The Higgins boat saw action in virtually every major Allied amphibious operation of the war. Beyond Normandy, it delivered troops to the beaches of southern France in Operation Dragoon. It carried soldiers across the Rhine River in the final invasion of Germany itself. In the Pacific, it put Marines ashore at Tarawa, Guam, Peleliu, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. More than 23,000 Higgins boats were manufactured during World War II. Higgins Industries itself built approximately 12,500 of these vessels, while the remainder came from licensed manufacturers, including Chris-Craft, which produced more than 8,000, along with smaller contributions from Owens Yacht Company, Richardson Boat, and Matthews Company. They served in every theater of operations and participated in every major landing. General Douglas MacArthur famously splashed out of a Higgins boat onto the Philippines in October 1944, fulfilling his promise to return 2 years after his forces had been driven from the islands. Marine General Holland Smith, the same officer who had championed Higgins boats before the war began, declared that without them, landings on Japanese-held beaches in large numbers would have been unthinkable. Coming from a Marine general, this was high praise indeed. The Marines had built their entire doctrine around amphibious operations, and the Higgins boat had made their doctrine possible. The story of the Higgins boat offers lessons that extend far beyond military history. It is a story about the clash between innovation and bureaucracy, between individual vision and institutional inertia that IT demonstrates how organizations can become so invested in their own procedures that they lose sight of their fundamental purpose. The Navy existed to defend the nation and win wars. The Bureau of Ships existed to support that mission by providing the best possible equipment to American forces. But somewhere along the way, the Bureau forgot this purpose. Protecting its own authority became more important than protecting American lives. Maintaining traditional methods became more important than adopting superior innovations. It took an outsider, a profane and pugnacious boat builder from Nebraska, to provide what the world's most powerful navy could not design for itself. And it took a Senate investigation to force the Navy to accept his help. Andrew Higgins did not live to see his full vindication in history. He died on August 1, 1952, at the age of 65, worn out by the tremendous effort of wartime production and the bitter disappointments that followed. After the war, military contracts evaporated almost overnight. Higgins Industries, which had employed tens of thousands of workers at its peak, could not survive the transition to peacetime. The company he had built was eventually dissolved. The man who had provided the boats that won the war ended his days nearly forgotten. His contribution to victory was largely ignored in the immediate post-war years. Popular histories of World War II focused on generals and admirals, on grand strategy and decisive battles. The humble landing craft that had made those battles possible received little attention. The public was more interested in glamorous weapons like the Mustang fighter and the Sherman tank than in plywood boats that ferried men to beaches. It was not until the late 1990s, during a resurgence of interest in World War II driven by the 50th anniversary of the war's major events, that Higgins and his boats began receiving appropriate recognition. Stephen E. Ambrose's writings about D-Day brought the Eisenhower quote to widespread public attention. The National World War II Museum was established in New Orleans specifically to honor the city where Higgins had built his empire of boats. Today, a memorial to Andrew Jackson Higgins stands in his hometown of Columbus, Nebraska. A duplicate sculpture overlooks Utah Beach in Normandy, France, where thousands of American soldiers once splashed ashore from the boats he designed. In 2019, Higgins was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame for his revolutionary landing craft designs. When Dwight D. Eisenhower sat in his Gettysburg office in 1964 and told Stephen Ambrose that Andrew Higgins was the man who won the war for us, he was making a claim that might seem excessive at first hearing. Many factors contributed to Allied victory. The industrial might of America, the courage of ordinary soldiers, the strategic brilliance of commanders, the sacrifices of allies around the world. But Eisenhower understood something fundamental that casual observers might miss. Without the ability to land armies across open beaches, none of those other factors could have been brought to bear. The whole strategy of the war would have been different if Higgins had not designed and built his boats. The Allies would have been forced to assault fortified ports directly, suffering massive casualties in every landing. The island-hopping campaign across the Pacific would have ground to a halt. The liberation of Europe might have been delayed by years or might never have succeeded at all. The Higgins boat was not a weapon in the conventional sense. Carried no devastating firepower. It sank no enemy ships. It dropped no bombs. But it solved a problem that had bedeviled military commanders throughout history. It gave armies the ability to strike where they chose rather than where the enemy was prepared to receive them. It turned coastlines from barriers into highways. More than 200,000 Americans crossed hostile beaches during World War II. Most of them arrived in Higgins boats. The men who designed those boats, who built them in the factories of New Orleans, who piloted them through shot and shell onto foreign shores, deserve to be remembered alongside the soldiers who charged up the beaches and the generals who planned the campaigns. Andrew Jackson Higgins fought his own war long before the shooting started. He fought against bureaucratic arrogance, institutional blindness, and the comfortable assumptions of men who believed they knew better than anyone else. He won that war just in time for his boats to win the larger one. The next time you see that famous photograph of soldiers wading toward Omaha Beach, look at the steel ramp framing the shot. Look at the wooden sides of the boat that carried them across the channel. And remember the man from Nebraska who built it, the officials who dismissed it, and the young men who wrote it into history.